You're listening to The Unsafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
Other features represent God's previous deliverance by the crossing of the sea. We're going to see that. The Song of Moses, that's here in chapter 15. The giving of the law and the smoke showing up in the tabernacle, that happened. We'll see that here in chapter 15. And the erection of the tent of testimony and everything that happened as a result of that. We'll see that again, too. But what this points at is that the seven bowls have a similar purpose. It's wrapping everything up with Israel.
The book of Revelation can be confusing for many people to understand. It really doesn't make any sense without taking into context the entire Bible. There are references to Israel, the Old Testament, even going as far back as Genesis. So how do we understand what Revelation is talking about? You must have a good understanding of how God uses Old Testament scripture to explain what is going to happen in the end times. Today, Pastor Ken is going to help you by breaking down chapter 15, verse by verse. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of Revelation, chapter 15, as he begins his message, The Beginning of the End.
We're in chapter 15. We're really moving through this. But what we see in chapter 15 is John picking up from where he was in chapter 11, verse 19. So now he's all of a sudden, okay, now we're going to be talking about judgment and judgment stuff again. So he's moving back to that theme. Remember, the last time he talked about it was again back in chapter 11, verse 19, where he said, "And the temple of God, which is in heaven, was opened, and the ark of his covenant appeared in his temple, and there were flashes of lightning, and sounds and peals of thunder, and an earthquake and a great hailstorm." But remember, the temple's open, because we're going to see here in chapter 15, he's seeing inside the temple, and he's seeing things going on inside the temple, and we're going to talk about that. Verse 1, "Then I saw another sign," and we've seen him already see two signs, and this is the third one. "I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous. 7 angels who had 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished." Now, I'm going to give you a warning about chapter 15. It relies on the Old Testament a lot. There is a lot of imagery and a lot of pictures in chapter 15 that come from the Old Testament. I mean, all over the place. And it starts right off here at the very beginning. In fact, in chapter 14, we talked about the cup of wine in verse 10, then the harvest in verses 14 to 16, and then the vintage in 17 to 20, the making of the wine. Well, now it's all going to be chronologically lined out. And when we get into the bowl judgments, it really, in chapter 16, it gets lined out. But what's happening here in chapter 15 is we're going to be introduced to 7 angels. And these 7 angels have a specific commission that they receive direct from God. Now remember, again, angel is a job description for a divine being. It means messenger. That's what it means in the Greek. And there are other titles that are given by Paul in the Scriptures. He also talks about rulers, principalities, powers, world rulers, different kinds of job titles. And then as we saw in the book of Daniel, we also saw that there's a prince of Greece, prince of Persia. So we have all these different names, but these are angels, okay? They're serving in that role as messenger. And prior to this, we've seen 2 great signs. So, and the Greek word is semeion, which means sign, and these were in heaven as well. It was in chapter 12. Remember, we saw the constellation and what was going on with that, and pointing us to look at it. Both were in chapter 12. This is what was in chapter 12. "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them down to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child." And as we took a look at that, we realized that that's a sign. Those are constellations that are actually in the heavens. And taking that apart, we found out that it points to the exact day that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin on September 11th, 3 BC, at about 9:15 in the evening. Yeah, it gets down to that exact when we look at it. You can take a look at what we went through in chapter 12 to get all of that. But this sign here in chapter 15, it's a sign just like that was, but this is a sign that is great and marvelous. The other one was not marvelous. This one's marvelous. It's especially awesome. I like that word better. In the Greek, the word can mean that. It's great or awesome because it takes what the first two signs were in chapter 12 and says this is going to fulfill all of it. It's going to be done. So we have God's wrath on nature, humankind, the dragon, the two beasts, everything is going to be pointed out with these 7 bowls that are going to be poured out here in chapter 16 when we get to it. Again, the first divine sign in Revelation was the woman in chapter 12, verses 1 and 3. The second one was the dragon, verse 3. Both were miracles or wonders because they created, again, this picture for us in the stars of reality on earth. And we saw this picture of what had been going on for centuries. Well, this third sign is also a miraculous scene in the skies, and I have not figured out what constellation, and nobody else has either, but it's pointing to the skies, so this might be something in the future. It's a preview of the great drama about to be played on earth in the majestic choir that's going to be prepared to sing the chorus at its triumphant conclusion. When the woman's conquering seed finally gets rid of the serpent and he goes to the pit, and that's in Revelation chapter 20. And all who the beast had sought to destroy will reign with Christ instead. Now, this sign in chapter 15, unlike the ones in chapter 12, is great and marvelous. And we know what the word great is, okay? We've studied that in the Greek already. It's megas. You get megaphone. You get mega box store. I mean, it's large. It's just, okay? It's great. The other word for marvelous is a different word, and it only shows up a few times in the New Testament. The Greek word is thaumaston, and it means to be a cause of wonder or worthy of amazement, wonderful, marvelous, or remarkable. That sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? Well, it is, because when you take a look at the instances that it shows up in the New Testament, it's usually about Jesus or something that Jesus has done. It's great itself because it's worthy of amazement, but this word marvelous shows up 6 times in the New Testament, that particular Greek word, and 2 times right here in chapter 15. So 2 of the 6 times it's used are right here in chapter 15, excuse me. Now again, of course, when you take a look at it, Jesus is quoting from Psalm 118, 22 to 23, where he's talking about him being the chief cornerstone, and it's marvelous. So that's Matthew 21, 43 and Mark 12, 11. Another reference is to the blind man who had his sight restored by Jesus, and he talks about how marvelous it was that somebody had had his sight restored, and of course it's what Jesus did. And then the other is in 1 Peter chapter 2. Now in 1 Peter chapter 2, it says, "You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who's called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." It's about Jesus too. It's interesting that there's this one word, and every time it shows up, it's talking about the Lord. It's talking about Jesus. And a common theme in all these 6 verses, these places where they show up, is it's God and his works, all of it. And God and his works that are done through Jesus. This vision is just like the ones that we saw in chapter 12, but the angels here are in awe, and they're presented as the ones who signal that history is about over with, because they've got God's wrath, and they're about to pour it all out and be done with it. But the overall awe is, again, these are the ones who, history's over with. And it points back to Genesis 3, to where it all began, back at the beginning. So we had Genesis 3, now we're all having it be ended here in the book of Revelation. So the signs. Now, it's 7 angels with 7 plagues. That's the sign. I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. Now, the word plague here is, well, I remember when I was studying this in college, I thought, oh, black plague? No. Plague in terms of something really bad has happened. So the Greek word itself is, get this, plagueis, plague. The English word is nothing more than a transliteration of the Greek. Okay, that's all it is. But it means a sudden hard stroke with some instrument, or a blow or wound caused by a blow, or a sudden calamity that causes severe distress, or a blow. This word is used, and we think about what happened to the Egyptians in the book of Exodus as all these plagues. But in the book of Exodus, if you study it, only one of the judgments that's poured out on Egypt is referred to as a plague. And it's the last one. Nothing else is referred to as a plague, which I thought was kind of interesting. I actually went back and read it, and by golly, that's right. In the Septuagint version of Exodus chapter 11, verses 1 to 9, it talks about this last wonder being a plague, which is the death of all the firstborn. So God pointed that out. He said very clearly that's what it is. And what we're seeing is this is God's wrath. So I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels with 7 plagues, which are the last, because in them the wrath of God is finished. Now, again, there's 2 words for wrath. One is thymos, and the other one's orge. And here in the book of Revelation, in several places, we're going to see both of them joined together. And that means something. That means the fierce wrath of God. We're going to see that in Revelation 19:15. As you read it in the Greek, it just says thymos orge, and it's kind of like, okay, I don't want to be there when that happens, because it's talking about the fierce wrath of God. But thymos, or thumos, is just an intense expression of the inner self. It's God thinking through and then judging based on what's been going on. It's a passionate longing. It's like the wine cup of God's passionate wrath, a state of intense displeasure. But orge is a state of really, really strong displeasure. We get the word orgy from it in the English. Orge is actually the word in the Greek. And it is a state of relative strong displeasure with a focus on the emotional aspect of the anger and the strong indignation. So these angels, these 7 angels, are going to inflict these plagues on mankind in fulfillment of what God is doing, what God is calling them to do. It's a repeat of something that took place once before. And we need to see this again as it points to God finishing His plan for His people Israel. Now, the church is not on planet Earth, but Israel is. So God is finishing His plan for Israel. And when I say it's something that we've seen before, when you study the Old Testament and you see how God judged Israel and sent them into captivity, these same words, orge, thymos, if you're looking at the Greek version of the Old Testament, they show up. It's God judging Israel for what they did. So this is a finishing up of that kind of judgment. Now, thymos is the venting of God's anger based on His wrath or His attitude towards sin. So, they both kind of fit together and mesh together from that perspective. The duty of these angels, when you really get down to it, is they're going to inflict 7 plagues, the last ones, and it's really interesting when you look at the Greek word, they use the word eschatos, which literally means the very last ones. And of these plagues, when you look at them, there's 7. 5 of them come from Exodus chapter 7 to Exodus chapter 10. They've happened before. The first and the third bowl plagues are reminiscent of what God did to punish the Egyptians to deliver His people. Other features represent God's previous deliverance by the crossing of the sea. We're going to see that. The Song of Moses, that's here in chapter 15. The giving of the law and the smoke showing up in the tabernacle, that happened. We'll see that here in chapter 15. And the erection of the tent of testimony and everything that happened as a result of that. We'll see that again, too. But what this points at is that the 7 bowls have a similar purpose. It's wrapping everything up with Israel. And it's also judging the world at the same time. And it's not for the church. So, you have to look at it from the perspective of there's reasons why you don't see the word church anytime after chapter 3. There's reasons why you don't see the word temple except for one reference to it in chapter 3 dealing with the Church of Philadelphia, and you don't see it any time after that. You see it only dealing with Israel. You see temple, but not connected with the church. You see temple connected with the nation of Israel. Now it says was finished, or to pour out on the earth the 7 bowls. It's going to finish, pour out, and finish it. And the words are actually and there's a tense used in the Greek, which is called the aorist prophetic. And it shows that God looks at the future as if it's already done. So he's talking about future events. John's writing in 90 plus AD because in his view, it's already been completed. So verse 2, and I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had been victorious over the beast and his image and the number of his name standing on a sea of glass, holding harps of God. Did we see a sea of glass before? Yeah, back in chapter 4, in chapter 5. Everybody was standing before the throne, and in front of the throne was this sea of glass. So once again, what this does is it tells us that we're back in the throne room. We understand that. We're back into where it was in Revelation chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. There it says, out from the throne come flashes of lightning, sounds of peals of thunder, and there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne there was something like a sea of glass, like crystal. And in the center and around the throne, 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. Now, again, remember, we have the thrones, we have the sea of glass, we have the elders who are around it. They're not on it, they're around it. And then the church is around it as well as all of the heavenly host, the billions and billions of people and divine beings who are out there. So, is this a description that we've seen before in the Scriptures? Yeah, actually, it is. In the book of Exodus, we get a description of what heaven looks like, actually the throne room. And it's when God has dinner with the 70 elders prior to the giving of the law. And you go, he had dinner with the 70? Yeah, he did. In Exodus chapter 24, it says, Moses went up to the mountain with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. They went up to eat. And under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. In other words, there's that sea, that clear sea again. Yet he did not stretch out his hand against the nobles of the son of Israel, and they saw God, and they ate and drank. So that's the throne room. In fact, when you take a look elsewhere in the Scriptures, it says that the divine council was actually there when the law was given. It actually says the law was given through angels. So, yeah, okay, I get that. The throne room came down. It was on Mount Sinai. Moses went up. The elders ate. And then 40 days later, they're playing with golden calves. It's literally 40 days after that they have the problem with the calf. In Ezekiel chapter 1, when the throne room comes down to planet Earth, Ezekiel talks about it as well. He says in verse 26, now above the expanse that was over their heads, there was something resembling a throne like lapis lazuli in appearance. Again, the sea, the crystal sea is what he's talking about. So he's looking up, and he sees a throne on it, and he sees somebody walking around. He's seeing God walk around in the throne room, is what he sees. In Revelation chapter 21, verses 10 and 11, we get John being taken away in the Spirit, and he's shown the holy city, the New Jerusalem. He gets a picture of that. Coming down out of heaven, having the glory of God, her brilliance was like a very costly stone, as a stone of crystal clear jasper. There it is again. So, hopefully you like bright, shiny stuff, okay? Because you're going to be living in a town that is made of bright, shiny stuff. That's the New Jerusalem. That's what it's going to look like. So we get it. The building materials of heaven, the building materials of the throne room, are brilliant and kind of hard to describe. So he has to keep using these references to different materials to be able to talk about it. In Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 to 11, we talked about the fifth seal. So, again, we have to remember we're going to see the sea of glass, and we're going to see these people standing around it, or standing on it, actually. Now, in Revelation 6, chapter 6, verses 9 to 11, the fifth seal, the Lamb broke the fifth seal. I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God, because of the testimony which they had maintained. And they cried out with a loud voice, saying, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from judging and avenging our blood on those who dwell on the earth?" So they're asking how long in chapter 6. In chapter 15, it's about to happen. And all of those survivors, all of those who survived and gave their life as a result of the persecution and following the instructions of the angels in chapter 14, are going to show up on this crystal sea. We know how long. And in chapter 14, verse 13, remember, those who die from this point forward in the Lord will be blessed. Now we're seeing what that blessing is. We're picking up on it. Verse 2, I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and those who had been victorious over the beast and his image and the number of his name, standing on a sea of glass holding harps of God. So these are the ones who have survived their confrontation. They didn't survive and stay alive physically. They have survived in the faith, and they've gone home to be with the Lord. Their life has been taken as a result of their testimony. They followed the instructions that the angel gave, saying, don't take the mark, because if you take the mark, it's eternally a problem. So John sees the seven angels. He has the seven plagues, but he sees that reason for the plagues too. The reason for the plagues is because of why they were killed. They were killed because of the beast, his image, and the number of his name. You have to remember, all three things are referenced here. Same as what was referenced in chapter 14. The glass tells us it's the throne room, but notice it says mixed with fire. That fire is a reflection of God's judgment. Stop and think about it. If the crystal sea reflects the glory of God, it's also going to reflect the judgment of God. And his judgment is called fiery, or the fire, over and over and over again in the scriptures. So here we see it again. The fire tells us that God's judgment is active because they see it reflected. Yes, it reflects his glory, but it also reflects the judgment.
Today's message was in the book of Revelation. Pastor Ken has been teaching from this prophetic book here on the Unsafe Bible. You hear often about people trying to predict the end of the world or referring to some kind of apocalyptic event. But the truth is, the real apocalypse or revelation of Jesus Christ is something unlike anything else. If you know Jesus, you see these events as something that God will bring about to eventually restore things to how they were meant to be. If you view God as an enemy, you would naturally perceive the events in Revelation as some foreign enemy seeking to wreak havoc on the world and bring it to ruin. So what's the truth? If you're curious about what we believe and what our core foundation is built on, Go to theunsafebible.com to learn more. Are you in the Jupiter, Florida area? If so, you're welcome to join us for these types of teachings in person. You'll find ways to contact us on our website, so you can learn when and where we meet each week. You can also access more teachings online by going to theunsafebible.com and looking under the Media tab. Catch up on any messages you've missed, or listen to one you already heard as a refresher. Once again, that's theunsafebible.com. We're so glad you took the time today to hear from God and His Word. Pastor Ken has more to share from the book of Revelation, so don't miss a single edition. In the meantime, continue growing on your own in this very peculiar book of the Bible. And join us again on the Unsafe Bible.